territory that is in control of other nations to the east, and now, the Gospels introduce us to in the days of the governor of Rome, and we're thinking, who is Rome? What's Rome all about? Sometimes that's one of the reasons why people are confused about that. They say, well, the Old Testament's got that different culture, got that different kind of flavor to it. I can't relate to that. I'll put that aside. I identify with what's going on in the Gospels. I can understand it. That's because it's Western. But that's no reason for us to reject the Old Testament. We need to learn as we go along. To remind you of where the transition takes place, these 400 silent years, we go back to the Babylonian Empire. We've talked about Babylon. Here is the area of Jerusalem and where Daniel, you remember, was. And when he was carried off into exile by Nebuchadnezzar, he took him all the way up through that same Fertile Crescent down the Euphrates River to Babylon, which is right here. That was his capital. And the Babylonian Empire lasted for most of Daniel's life. And then at the close of that period, it was replaced with the nation of Medo-Persia, and their capital was Susa, which is not very far away. That's where Esther's story takes place. And then the return of the exiles along the same route, the three different travelings to return to Jerusalem. We're still talking about the land to the east. And then, of course, we covered the area of Alexander the Great. He was born and raised in Macedonia. His father was Philip, the king of Macedonia, a little bitty country at the moment. He got the itch to take over the world and proceeded to do so. But you'll notice where he went. Where did he go? He went east. He went east. He swept down into Egypt first, but then he went all the way over to the Indian border, the Indus River, and probably had every intention now of turning and going west, but died prematurely, as we say, in his mid-30s. Alexander was a charismatic leader, a powerful leader, a shrewd leader. The study of his battles is one of invention. He never did the same thing twice. He was unpredictable. He had no modus operandi, as they say, to make him predictable. And he was just astoundingly successful. And when he died, rather than have the wherewithal, maybe the trust or the confidence in any of his generals, to give that leadership over to one more, he simply said to the question, who's going to be your successor? He said, it will go to the greatest, which only meant that he was dooming his empire to civil war and infighting and self-destruction for the next couple of hundred years, making the whole empire of Alexander deteriorate from the very beginning. But culture was established in Alexander's conquest. You had him coming from Little Pella, up Greek. They had invented democracy. You might remember, although we have to say with an asterisk, because they also invented mass slavery west of China. China was already into that. So you had slaves and you had freemen, but among the small percentage of freemen, you had democracy, which was a new concept. Now, the other thing I want to mention about this before we go forward is that Alexander comes out of Pella and he crosses over and has his goes past Troy, has his first big war in Granicus. And Granicus is just a hoot and a holler away from this little isthmus here, which is where the story of Rome will begin and end, interestingly enough. So we'll come back to that. Okay. So after Alexander dies and he subjects his whole kingdom to infighting, then we move, the focus of the Bible moves us west. We've been all over here, we've been up here, but now we're going all the way over to the boot of Italy. Nothing's going on of any significance in the boot of Italy. They're all tribesmen, backwater folk. There are some little kingdoms, but nothing like the East, nothing like Greece, nothing like the Babylonian Empire. And so it's all just prime for development, as real estate people say. I want to have time today to talk about 4 essential characteristics of Rome. I'm not going to do this in chronological order, so we will be going back and reviewing some of these things, but I'm doing it topically. As I used to teach history for the school, I would say that there are 2 basic primary characteristics about Rome that make it easy to remember. Law and order, just like the television show. There's actually more, but we're going to start with that. The first characteristic about Rome is law. It was a nation of laws. And it starts off historically as a monarchy in 753, and that goes until 509 BC. Here is a map of the early boot. Rome is just a crossroads in a swamp-infested area of 7 different hills. Of course, that's the classic remembrance of Rome, is it's built on 7 hills and all that romantic stuff. And but the one thing it has to its advantage is that it is centralized north and south. And so it's established as a trade route and becomes popular for not only for trade but also for eventually setting up stores. You know, there's the old story about the origin of Rome being that Romulus and Remus established Rome, and there's where you get the figure of the she-wolf feeding them and everything. Nobody really knows where the origin of Rome is. It's just that it was just another community effort that kind of exploded eventually on its own. One of the things that does seem to be very, it does have some historical notations, is that in those very early days, as the frontier Rome began to grow, as just like with out west in the Americas, you had more brave, courageous frontier guys than you had women. And you remember how, in the West they tried to put ads in the paper, brides, and all this kind of stuff. Well, what they did in Rome was they moved out, I don't have it marked here, but they moved over to another town, a little more populated, and they kidnapped a whole lot of the women from Sabine. That's a very famous story. Made some statues and things about that. Dragged them over so that they would be able to populate. The Etruscans were a little more developed to the north, and so the Roman people really borrowed a lot of culture and civilization and expertise from the Etruscans. They were earlier than people. Down here, the Greeks are beginning to spread on the bottom of the boot, and the toe in the football, as they say, and the Carthaginians are also, they're across the Mediterranean, and they're already making headway in this area too. So as the whole area is growing, Rome is growing with it and prospering as a commercial enterprise. George Grant has this quotation which tells you the character of Rome from the very beginning. He said, the question is, who was Rome? And the real question, he says, is who Rome wasn't. They completely absorbed Greek religion, borrowed Gaelic cuisine, mimicked Slavic morality, copied Carthaginian materialism, adopted Egyptian hierarchies. Eventually, Rome consumed all the neighbors they had borrowed and stolen from. And you see remnants of that when you say, well, what's the difference between the Greek mythology and the Roman mythology? Well, the Greek mythology gods have Greek names and the Romans ones have Roman names, but they're the same gods. Why is that? Because they stole them. They steal everything. Rome absorbs everyone that they take over. That's one of the, it's civilization on the cheap, but it worked. And they were able to grow and to thrive in doing that. The monarchy lasted for 7 different kings. Ironically, when you think forward of the type of Caesars that they would have, ironically, the nation, Rome decided to shut down the monarchy because the kings were corrupt. Imagine that. To take a stand on a corrupt king and get rid of him. Imagine that. Anyway, I digress. They stopped the monarchy in 509 and they introduced something that was brand new to the world. Greek had its democracy, so they went and they stole those ideas and they perfected it a little bit and made it a republic. Now, republic is a representative type of government. It was an experiment, just like people say the American government is an experiment. United States government isn't the first republic. Rome was. And that lasted 500 years. That lasted from 509 to 27 BC. And during that period of time, the republic embraced this well-known symbol and the letters SPQR, which simply translates to Senate and the People of Rome. And they were very proud of that. The Republican government was formulated on 2 different classes or 2 different courts or 2 different forms of government. The one was, it goes by a couple of different names, the populares, those who are not of the up and ups, the rich people, who they are the ones who come together because they want more of the things that the rich people have. And so they are looking for change. And so they organize and send representatives to the city of Rome for that. The other ones are the optimates up on top, and they are the ones who are the wealthy landowners and like things the way they are, thank you very much. And so you had the wealthy who said, well, what do we need to change for? Everything is just fine. And you had the rest of us saying, you know, we want this, we want that, we want the other. And so that was kind of how the Senate developed. You have artist renditions of Senate speeches where they are all sitting very calmly, listening to one person. In its better days, maybe that was the case, but it was usually just a shouting match. And the government functioned with good, well, it ran for 500 years. Lord willing, United States government will last 500 years. I am not talking this down at all. This would be great. It went for 500 years, but eventually the second law of thermodynamics, to make it simple, everything eventually breaks down with time, and for various reasons, corruption being one. You had when everything was starting to fall apart, you had a phenomenon going on. I'm going to talk about the military participation in a minute. But during the last couple of hundred years, it was military leaders that were rising to the surface as popular figures more than the politicians. You didn't have hero politicians, you had hero military. And so the more conquests that the military leaders would make for the Republic of Rome, the more they were worshipped as heroes. And then they would leave their armies and return to Rome, and they would be elected, and they would have their places in the Senate, and they saw a good thing. So that's one way that people in the populares could get ahead, is by joining the army, rising in the ranks, winning a couple of battles, coming back, being voted in on the Senate, and now they're optimates. You know, now we don't want things to change. And that's one of the ways they could do it. And one of the most famous of those guys was, of course, Julius. He's not Julius Caesar. I forgot, is Gaius Julius. Yeah, thank you, Janet. Gaius Julius is his name. He is a commander extraordinaire, but he is fed up with the disorganization, the way that Roman government is falling apart in his day. And up until this time, there was the basic rule that was probably set by the Senate, was that you have to keep the Roman army away from the city of Rome as a way of submitting to civilian government. You march the army into Rome, and we're thinking you're going to try to take over. That is what the big decision for Gaius Julius was, that he said, Rome is falling apart, it needs rescuing. I'm going to take my army into Rome, and that's what crossing the Rubicon was all about. So he crossed the Rubicon River, that was the border. You're not supposed to bring the army past that river. He marched them down past the river right into Rome, took over, was given a title called dictator. Dictator was a title that was given for, developed in the last 150 or so years of Rome's history so far, as somebody who we put in charge for a temporary fix. Something is falling apart, we'll give this guy one-man rule so he can solve the problem, and then we take it back, we remove his power. And that was done a couple of times. He was given dictator, and because he did such an effective job and because his popularity soared, they called him dictator for life. Now, historians debate over Gaius Julius' real motives. And, some are very sympathetic to him and some are not. But we know that eventually the senators, remember, the ones who don't like change, the wealthy, decided that they'd had enough of Gaius Julius, and they are the ones who organized the assassination of Gaius Julius. And, we're all very familiar with Et tu, Brute, because one of the senators named Brutus was his good friend, and he was standing there with his knife. But apparently the really last words of Gaius Julius were, "You have killed the Republic." So if that's the case, then whether he was, illusion or not, he was, that gives you the suspicion that he was after rebuilding and restoring the Republic and not taking it over. But his words proved true, and that was in 27 BC. And his words proved true, and he was eventually replaced by his nephew, Augustus, and what's his real name, Janet? Octavian, yes, Octavian. And so he becomes the first one given the term Caesar, which means king. And ever since the title had been given to him, that title has carried through not only Western civilization, but Eastern culture as well. You had the German Kaiser, that was Caesar. You had the Russian Tsar, that's Caesar. You had all of these adaptations to it. He was just the very first, and changed the Republic into an empire. And the empire itself lasted another 500 years. So this was no small potatoes, and we could still look and admire Rome for those things. History always talks about the 12 Caesars, and they were probably the most effective or influential, both positively and negatively. Nero was one of the 12 Caesars. Caligula was one of the 12 Caesars. You had guys who were nuts, being on top and running the greatest nation in the world, and they were nuts. They were nutcases. Getting a clue? And And the 12 Caesars are what everybody focuses on. But during this 450 years or so, there were 84 who would take the name Caesar for Rome before it fell. And most of them, if you notice, if you can just glance at this last column, you'll see a lot of zeros. On this end, you'll see a lot of zeros, a lot of ones, sometimes some teens. The Caesars were, it was not a very popular position to hold. And the easiest way to get rid of you was to kill you. And so they didn't hold elections, they just killed the Caesar. Okay, oh, sorry about that. And it went on and on and on. 84 in just 450 years, pretty amazing. Shows you that already the decline of Rome was going on. Now, I told you I was going to come back and talk to you about the military. That's the order. So first we had law, now we got order. We go back to those early days of Rome as just a trading post. In their early days, they not only profited from the Etruscans and from others and got stronger and stronger that way, but they also became afraid of their neighbors and began to send their little armies out to make sure that their neighbors weren't going to be a problem. And then those armies would win and come back with booty and all kinds of things, and Rome would go stronger. They first went up to the Etruscans, didn't like them, they messed around with them, and chased off the Celts to the north. And then they turned south, and they went all the way down to introduce themselves to the Greeks and the Carthaginians. And then they sailed over to Sardinia and up and got the islands that surrounded the city. They were, and Rome began to develop an interesting phenomenon. Every time they went to war, they won. How about that? Every time they went to war, they won. So he said, wow, this is a good thing. Let's do this again. And so their world began to expand as their military began to perfect itself. This is how you should fight. We're going to change this to this. They became much more sophisticated, much more organized, and all of the attention was given to the military in terms of its ability to expand our nation. They, after the islands were taken, they started picking a fight with the Carthaginians to the south during the long years of the Punic Wars. That's when Hannibal took his elephants over the Alps thinking, well, I'll attack from the north and nobody will expect me. And but in the process of that, Rome seized not only the southern coast of the Mediterranean, but also up into Spain, and they were before long they were beginning to envelop the entire Mediterranean. By the height of the Roman Empire, now this is 117 AD, by the height of the Roman Empire, they had surrounded the Mediterranean Sea. They called it our sea, Mare Interum. And in fact, interim is interesting because I've always said, the Mediterranean Sea was the first internet. You could reach anybody you wanted from anywhere, by it to anywhere. And that was pretty amazing. You know, if you wanted to send a text from Rome to Alexandria, it just goes straight there. It was pretty neat. They surrounded it. They called it our sea. You'll notice some other things up here. Britannia is also claimed by this time. Oceanus Atlanticus, that's where that name comes from. So there's some familiarity there. It's interesting to take note governmentally how this was divided for purposes of control. You had senatorial provinces. They were the most important key areas of trade and economic growth. And then you had the outliers, the imperial provinces, and this simply just marked the organization of states, we would call them today, for tax purposes and for recruitment and for other material things. So there was a great deal of organization to the Roman Empire. Third item that I want you to know about is concrete. Kind of takes you by surprise, doesn't it? Rome invented one thing. They stole everything else. They invented one thing. They invented concrete. Hey, this works pretty well. And they went to town with it. They built. We're all very familiar, of course, with Titus's arch. This is the arch that Titus was honored with in the city of Rome after he sacked Jerusalem in 70 A.D. Remember that date? 70 A.D. They built him an arch, and on the inside of the panels of the arch, you can see the depictions of him hauling off booty from the temple of Jerusalem. You know, there's the menorah, the most recognizable symbol. But what they really did was they brought back everything from the treasury. All 500 years of accumulation of gold from the treasury of Jerusalem's temple. What was the date of that sack? 70 A.D. They built the arch in was dedicated in 81 A.D. Guess what else they built right away with the money from the Jerusalem temple? The Colosseum. That's where the money came from. The most impressive ancient stadium in the world. And it was built on money that had been procured from the Jews in Jerusalem. Roman Masons in this empire period, the AD period, actually became more influential in Roman civilization than the military. The military was having trouble keeping morale up, keeping order among the ranks, keeping the victories up. They would have ups and downs, but mostly beginning to, at this time they got down. One of the reasons is because the work of masons, the work of construction, sucked all of the talent and all of the engineers and all of the workers. And of course, a majority of them were slaves also. And Rome just went crazy building things with this wonderful invention, concrete. They built over 224 theaters throughout the empire. They built over 900 baths. They built well over 200 temples. And remember, temples are not churches. Temples were not places where you go to worship. Temple was just a big building where you kept a statue in honor of that god. And of course, it was usually the guy who profited the most from a battle dedicated to that god, and he would thank the god by building yet another temple and put another statue in it. And so you had that going on. Along with those temples were these greater and more magnificent statues. They began building huge statues of their heroes. If you go to Rome today, you will go to the museum and you'll see the 10 surviving pieces of a statue made of Constantine. Now, this would have been the 4th century. And that's in Rome. In Milan, they actually have taken models of those pieces and reconstructed the statue as they think it probably looked. And this is what they come up with. See this person standing here? That's probably the size of the statue of Constantine the Great. And so it's amazing what they would continually build. But statues were nothing. Temples, sophomore mark. Baths, everybody makes a bath. Let's see him make an aqueduct. Building aqueducts became the great heyday for ancient Rome. Not because they needed water so much for survival. They had the river that ran through the city. But they did it because Romans were now feeling very luxurious. And they liked the idea of having as much water to their disposal as possible. And so building aqueducts, delivering water from as far away as 57 miles by aqueduct became the latest rage. Here's one illustration of all of the various kinds of things, equipment, engineering depictions that are necessary for a successful aqueduct. But the greatest feat of engineering was the fact that it had to be done on a gentle slope all the way. It wasn't ever forced. It was gravity induced from beginning to end. So it had to start tall and end short for miles and miles and miles. And it couldn't be too sharp an angle because the water would then rush in and flood any repository that you had. It couldn't be too shallow because then the water would be easily stopped by something in the way. Aqueducts are stunning in how many there are left throughout the Roman Empire. They webbed all the way through the empire. They were just all over the place. And engineers and construction people just built one after the other, after the other, after the other, and it became the all-consuming work of the Roman Empire in the last closing centuries. You can still see many of these aqueduct ruins that are there, and they're all kinds of shapes and designs. Here's look at the elaborate crisscrossing that this one's done in order to keep the gravity field even and to handle it and to get it where it needs to go. The city of Rome itself had 11. City of Rome itself had water delivered to it by 11 different aqueducts. You had all of these baths that I mentioned became the preoccupation of senators who didn't have enough to do, and they would go hang out at a bath. It wasn't that they were dingy and needed a shower. It was a social scene. It was, and the more opulent the baths are, the better, and the more attraction you'll get, and the more conversation can go on, and the more important those places become. And so there were, you can count 11 different baths coming in. I mean, different aqueducts coming into the city of Rome toward the end there. But they did more than just that. The Masons built many other things. One of the last enterprises using just concrete, primarily concrete, was Nero's house. It's called the Domus Aurea, and there are remnants of it that still stand today. This was one internal part of it, and it was built primarily with concrete. But by this time, by even Nero's time, concrete was building these amazing things was becoming expensive, and people were not interested anymore in funding grandiose projects like this. And so the popularity of all of these huge statues and temples and baths started to dwindle even by Nero's time. Here's an artist's rendition of what the Domus Aurea looked like. He had a full open sea down here. This is all water. That's a boat that's in there. And he would just entertain him. He would plan to entertain himself by riding his royal barge around. You had all of the internal rooms here, the gardens here, and that, of course, is a big statue of Nero himself. What a guy! And so that was one of the last efforts attempted using that concrete method. Later on, toward the 7th century, Justinian will employ the concrete method of building to make an artificial harbor in Caesarea. They found out that the formula for their concrete actually grew stronger in water. So it made it perfect for building a humongous harbor in Caesarea. And so that's one of the really last efforts that they made doing this. Here's an artist's cutaway of one of the more elaborate baths in Rome. And you can see it's no 10-minute shower. You would spend all day here, and you would see everybody, and you would talk all kinds of politics and things. One of the only monuments that still stands to this day is the Pantheon in Rome. And of course, if you ever get to Rome, don't leave without seeing the Pantheon. It's a very interesting construction. In the front, it's got the standard Roman front with the columns and very solid looking. But then you step in, and the interior of the Pantheon is round, perfectly round. And because it is so old, because it's 2,000 years old, they've decided that they're not going to try to keep it up or restore the outside. It would have been marble, it would have been a gorgeous building. But they've just left it with the concrete, left it with the basic construction material, and so it looks just like an old warehouse today. But you should go inside, and when you do, you are stunned. This is an artist's rendition from probably the middle of the 18th century. It was built to be a temple to the gods, plural, Pantheon. And so there were probably many of these statues, but none of them were Herculean, if I may use the term, to steal one god's name. You had, and of course in doing this, it was to honor not the gods themselves, but Rome. Rome was gifted, blessed by the gods. And their success and their empire and everything about them was all about the fact that they had survived by such overwatching of these gods that they built the Pantheon. But by the fall of the Roman Empire, in 609 AD, it was changed over to a Christian church. And so the Christian church owns it to this day. Now, not only is there the dome up on top, this also was, Roman engineering. This was, this was like, when was this built? I think this was, let's see, 126 AD. They built that dome. No supporting structure that's visible from it. And the whole dome shape, of course, was brand new, a concept and glorious. The whole building itself, including the dome, is built on the principle of a sphere. It's completely round from top to bottom in terms of its design and engineering. And the dome is made of concrete. But they've figured out how to feather the concrete so that it's lighter and lighter as it goes toward the top. And the only light is from the center, open circle. I forget what it's called. Thank you. And it's there for you to see to this day. It's an amazing sight. That great statue of Constantine was originally to be housed in the temple to Maxentius, which is weird. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. He was going to put it in the temple of Maxentius. The temple of Maxentius was the very last building built with this construction method of concrete building, and it still stands to this day as well. By the time that the capital moved and they built the Hagia Sophia, the concrete method of building had been abandoned, and now they were using bricks and mortar instead of just solid concrete. So that's passing. Even by the time they built the old St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome, the concrete way of building was set aside, and it was built much more along the lines of this, with bricks and stone. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is what Justinian did. I said that the harbor was the last. The harbor was concrete, but the last thing Justinian did was he built this harbor in Constantinople. That's 7th century, that's what that was. By the time the empire had fallen, by the 4th century or so, the economic conditions in Rome had deteriorated also, and so now you had people in shops and in houses occupying spaces of these glorious temples and forums, and in order to build their little walls and for their animals and their houses, they started stealing the stones already pre-cut from the temples and from all of the other monuments and using them, and that's why there's so much ruins in Rome today. So that was the third essential characteristic of Rome. Now we get to the last characteristic of Rome, which is its decline. The problems with the Roman Empire were twofold. The first problem it had was its limits of centralized government. You had a huge empire with no way of mass or quick or immediate communication. And that was a real problem. You had very slow communication to the generals. They're saying, what should we do now? And finally Senate decides what to do, sends it back. It's very slow. And that led to most of the outlying regions just making their decisions on their own. And so the centralized government wasn't working as well as it should. There was by the latter half, the AD period, the military was showing signs of fatigue. They were compromising on the training. They were compromising on the armor. They were compromising on the strategies. They were bringing in more barbarians to be soldiers. Some of them didn't even speak their language, and so that became an issue. And as one historian points out, Hadrian's Wall, which was built in 122 AD. There it is. You remember Hadrian's Wall? It's in the British Isle, and it was meant to cut off Scotland from England when Rome occupied England. And one historian, I think very astutely, makes the observation. She says this is the first sign of the decline of the Roman Empire. Nowhere else would Rome ever think, what do you mean we have a border? We don't have a border. We win everywhere we go. Everywhere we go, we call it ours. But all of a sudden, we're building a wall, and we're saying, you don't come over to our side. This is our side. You stay over there. And this historian said that's the first sign of Rome's decline is when they built that wall. So there are limits to centralized government. There are also the fact that the Huns to the east, to the far east, are now beginning to make an impression. This is the part of history nobody ever really understands or makes connections with. The Huns from the east, Genghis and Kublai, are on the rise, and their empires are humongous, and now they're doing the same thing that Alexander did to them, and they're pushing west. And by 380 or so, the Huns are beginning to harass the northern Germanic tribes above the empire, and as a result of that, some of the Germanic tribes are fleeing south, wanting to get away from them. And when they are pushed back with resistance by Romans, Romans took pride in their citizenship. You were either Roman or barbarian. But when they started to push back on that, then the barbarians themselves became angry and started to terrorize the northern border of Rome. And so you had the rise of aggressive barbarians going on. And the western provinces got tired of being left alone and started out being much more independent, acting much more controlling of their own affairs. So that was the limits of centralized government. The limits of decentralized government, in other words, you remember that map, everybody is like a state, and so that's how they handled that organizational period. But operating on their own, eventually meant the abandonment of the city of Rome as the capital. This was weird. Rome, the city of Rome was Rome. All these statues, all these temples, all these concrete buildings. Yeah. But by the time that things began to deteriorate and the various provinces showed more independence, they used several different experiments in breaking up the empire. One of the most well-known is when they broke it up into 4 different sections. And they had Constantius in one section, and Maximian in another section, and Galerius in another section, and Diocletian in another section. He said, you guys are independent, you do your own thing. And everybody thought that would be a great solution. But it didn't last very long, and Constantius, who is up here in the north, had a son named Constantine, and Constantine decided he wanted to reunite the empire himself. And so he went to battle with the other guys. It's in his final battle with one of those 4 guys named Maxentius. Remember that temple his statue was in? His statue was in the temple of Maxentius. And Maxentius is when he's going to fight to, he's fighting to win control. It just didn't make sense to me. Anyway, it's before that last battle at the Milvian Bridge, where Constantine is apparently converted to the Christian faith. And he wins the battle and therefore becomes Christian. He consolidates the empire, but later on in his reign, he will realize that the city of Rome is too far west and there are too much independence, too much harassment from the barbarians. The Roman soldiery, the army is breaking down. We need to move east. And we need to move east because that's where the educated people are. That's where the money is. That's where the safety is. And so they're going to move the capital out of Rome and they're going to move it into what they called Constantinople. It was going to be the new Christian Rome. No temples to gods, churches. And the construction was going to be all about the renewal of the Christian faith and the advancement of the Christian faith. And that left Rome, the city, vulnerable to the further invasions of the barbarians in the west. Until finally, in the 5th century, a German warlord named Odoacer, however you want to pronounce it, sacked the city of Rome. Did so very gently for a sack. Didn't really destroy much. Just took over. Just walked in, said, "I'm new king," and then went about its business. The other aspect of the decline of Rome, of course, is credited to the rise of Christianity. Secular historians will give this a sniff, because they don't understand what they're talking about, and will say, yes, this was going on at the same time. The rise of Christianity was against that backdrop of polytheism. You remember the Pantheon? The glorious thank you note from Rome to all the gods. Pantheism had always been one of their pluses. It didn't matter which one you focused on. You could focus on whichever god you wanted. But the gods were, they were where the strength of Rome came from. And they built that great thank you in Pantheon as a notation of that. And here comes these Christians out of nowhere, and they rise up, and the church in Rome had already started and was going very strong by the time Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. And they, but they say, well, no, we're 2 kingdom people. Yes, we want to be good citizens. We're even told in the Bible to be good citizens, but we worship one God. Now, I want you to understand the backdrop to that. That's an insult. It's like saying, somebody crosses the southern border and says, we don't like the Constitution. You're invading. You're wanting to change us. And the heat is turned up, of course, because they see the decline of the Roman Empire going on all around them. And so they become very jealous of that, and they become very angry with Christians over that. And it doesn't help when Christians start being not bending to persecution. You know, this famous story of Polycarp. Oh, Polycarp, 80 years old. All you got to do is light incense, Polycarp, and we'll send you home. You don't have to do anything more than that. Just give us a nod that you're a good Roman, and we're fine. He wouldn't do it. And so they were persecuted and sometimes killed for lack of conformity. They would not be good Romans first. And for suspicion of sedition. You're wanting to take over the empire. And the stronger, of course, the more numerous they got, the more concern for that. And then, of course, out of the blue, Constantine converts in 313. What's that all about? And he starts making all of these changes. Now, Constantine was not, pure as the driven snow after he was converted, if he was converted. He still was vicious. He still was cruel. He still exercised his authority in some very heinous ways. But he had a vision now. He had a target. He had a God to serve, and he did it. And what Constantine did was amazing. He wasn't one of these guys that just promises to the moon and does something in the opposite direction. He said, I'm going to do this, and he did it. And he changed the whole empire. In the Edict of Milan, he made Christianity acceptable. Christianity is one of us, guys, okay? It's not a problem anymore. And, of course, with that, now you had politicians looking at each other saying, well, if Caesar's Christian, how am I going to get ahead? How am I going to keep my job? How am I going to do this? How are we going to do that? I guess we're going to go to church. And that's why I say when in Rome. Everybody now is Christian. Don't know what it means, can't spell it, doesn't matter. Just go to church. And that I could take another hour talking to you about how that influenced the Church of Christ going forward, probably for worse than less, but than good. All right. The close of the empire, the so-called fall of the Roman Empire, is seen in two particular ways. You remember this little isthmus right here? You remember that's where Alexander the Great started from? You remember? And you went on a full circle. We come right back to that little isthmus now. That's where Constantinople is. And the capital of Rome, capital of the Roman Empire, stays in Constantinople. And they changed it used to be old Byzantium. That was the name of the city. Byzantium. And it becomes, for the next 1,000 years, the kingdom of Byzantium. 1,000 years. This puppy didn't die fast. In the West, however, the church, remember the church in Rome, now looks to the east and says, we're all by ourselves. And so it was the church that took charge politically, militarily, economically, of what was left of the West. And that was the origin of the Holy Roman Empire. All right. 2,000 years of history in an hour. Not bad. Any questions? Yes?
So I saw on one of the maps, so the Celts lived in right around Italy, and they went all the way up.
I saw that on the map, Josh. I couldn't figure out what exactly that meant. The Celts we just attribute to Scotland, and so the fact that they labeled them Celts, I'm not sure what that meant. I didn't dig into that.
They're just another barbarian tribe.
They're just another barbarian tribe.
They're related up north. What do you think, George? Were they related up north?
Yeah, headmaster.
They were the same nationalities.
Joshua, these were the in-laws.
Yeah, they were the in-laws. Yeah.
They were the in-laws.